as usual with this channel, in this video I want to spend some time talking about, as usual with this channel, late antiquity and the end of the Western Roman Empire. Specifically, I want to address something that's been blowing up on the internet this week and that has caused something of a storm over on X, which is this post by Elon Musk stating rather bluntly that the Roman Empire fell due to a general population collapse, which has been seen by at least 2.2 million people thus far, and probably more by the time that I upload this. And by the way, since this is a longer discussion, I don't really have much of a way to animate this, so you may just want to listen to it while doing something else, like playing Hearts of Iron. So, is that line of argument correct? Well, there was a decline in population from the 2nd century onward, perhaps as much as a 20% decline by the 5th century, and following the 5th century, so the 500s, there was even more of a general population decline and a general abandonment of cities. That much is true, and no historian or archaeologist would really ever dispute it. That being said, any attempt to explain the collapse of the western half of the Roman Empire also has to explain why the eastern half of the empire did not collapse, which is where the notion of population decline essentially just goes right out the window, never mind the fact that it is chronologically wrong. The fall of the Western Roman Empire holds such a grip over our collective imagination because it is central to anxieties over our own civilizational health, and it's had this grip since at least the French Revolution, if not earlier. Essentially, the argument goes, if we can explain why the Roman Empire fell, then we can see warning signs of this in the present day, and then we can prevent a similar collapse of our own states. Ascribing that collapse to one single cause often says more about the individual in question and their own concerns, rather than what actually happened, which is less of a single, stunning cause, and more like death by 1,000 cuts before, as the historian Guy Halsell phrases it, accidentally committing suicide, which is a much less exciting and a much less seductive answer. So, dealing with anything involving ancient population statistics is notoriously difficult due to a general lack of sources for this particular question. We do have, for example, fairly good records for the mid to late Republican period, but even this data is fraught with issues. The data is derived from the famous Roman census, which required, at least in theory, that Romans return to their hometowns and they report themselves when the census was being gathered. The gist of the problem for the Republican period, and here I am drawing on a rather excellent book, Nathan Rosenstein's Rome at War, Farms, Families, and Death in the Middle Republic, is that there is a consistent fluctuation in the population of Italy as recorded in the census, which basically comes down to us via Livy, during the Second Punic War onwards. From the end of the war in 201 BC until 164 BC, there is a general population increase as recorded in the census. From 164 BC until about 125 BC, the numbers are all over the place, and they jump by quite a bit during each census, far more than really should be expected. Historical opinion is basically broken into two opposing camps, and just to reiterate, this is for when we do have good data by the standards of classical history that we are able to actually work with. And those two opposing camps are referred to as the high count and the low count, which have differing views on how accurate the census numbers are. Essentially, was Italy overpopulated or not? The bulk of the evidence seems now to favor the low count interpretation, which basically argues that the differences in the census are a result of citizens not reporting for years, which line up with rather costly wars fought outside Italy, particularly in the Iberian Peninsula, where casualties are potentially up to 40%. In other words, it's not that there was a decline in population in one year, and then in the next year there's some massive population spike, and then in the next there's a sharp drop. It's that people were deliberately not reporting to the census in order to avoid being called up for service in conflicts where casualties were high, and where there was not much opportunity for plunder or booty. The point here is that there are all these debates and disagreements when our evidence is actually fairly abundant, and much of that surviving evidence is probably incorrect as to the population of Italy during this period. It is even more difficult to have discussions like this for periods where our evidence for population records, such as the census, are even more sparse, like in late antiquity. There have been attempts to determine population numbers based on things like surviving records of the grain dole and how that changed over time, because the grain dole was a perk given to citizens, and after the Antonine Constitution granted citizenship to all free men in the Roman Empire in the 200s, it might be able to be used as a placeholder for the census, but at the end of the day, in late antiquity, our evidence for this sort of thing simply is not as good as it is for the Republican period. With that in mind, there are some things we can definitely say about the population of the Roman Empire, and the historian Kyle Harper, in his book The Fate of Rome, Climate, Disease, and the End of an Empire, puts it as follows. Trying to reconstruct population levels in the ancient world is a crude business. It always has been. Already in the 1750s, David Hume and the Scottish divine Robert Wallace laid out arguments for wildly divergent views of the populousness of ancient nations. The debate has not always been so genial, but already in view were the outlines of a controversy that has continued down to the present day between high counters such as Wallace and low counters such as Hume. Even in recent times, credible voices have spoken in favor of peak numbers for the Roman imperial population ranging from 44 million to 100 million. Where there is broad agreement is around the fact that the populations within the empire grew in the 150 years after the death of Augustus and reached their maximal extent on the cusp of the Antonine Plague. But absolute figures remain necessarily speculative. Though the debate between Hume and Wallace carries on among modern scholars, the soundest arguments point us to believe that there were some 60 million inhabitants in the Roman Empire when Augustus died, and closer to 75 million a century and a half later, when Galen first arrived in Rome. Estimates for late antiquity, for both halves of the Roman Empire, in total is perhaps somewhere around 50 million, maybe 45 million, maybe 55 million. It's not at all clear. No matter how you attempt to estimate the population, however, we do not have sufficient evidence that population decline was the reason for the end of the Roman Empire. Although this is not to say that it was not a factor. So, with that in mind, what does the evidence that we do have actually point to? Well, there is a lot going on in late antiquity when it comes to climate change, plague, and political instability, but really, when you're talking about the end of the Roman Empire, what that really means is the decline and the eventual end of cities and the economic system that connected them all together. So, for the rest of this video, what I'm going to try and do is summarize the views of 3 historians on how this all fell apart, and those 3 are Guy Halsall, John Liebeschutz, and Chris Wickham, whose book, Framing the Early Middle Ages, has essentially become the consensus on what happened to the Western Roman Empire since its publication in 2005. The city was the key to Rome's political, social, and economic life, and in the late 5th century, many cities in the Western Empire were either abandoned, or they were remarkably reduced in size, with full abandonment or severe shrinkage fully arriving in the early 6th century, after the plague of Justinian and the wars of reconquest launched by the eastern half of the Roman Empire that ravaged Italy, Spain, and North Africa. The city essentially defined Rome's understanding of the world. It is, after all, where we get the word civilization. When conquering a new territory, the Roman state very consciously built itself into legitimacy by doing 2 things. The first is the literal construction of Roman civilization. Aqueducts, paved roads built in the Roman manner, Roman-style walls as opposed to, say, Gallic-style fortifications, things of that nature. The second, arguably more important thing that they did was the implementation of what is called civic evergetism. Although sometimes you'll see it written as eugetism, it means the same thing. Local elites were co-opted into the Roman imperial project by being given a place in Roman society. Aristocrats served as the administrators of a given region, and while they may have had grandiose estates out in the country, they did their governing from the city center. It was their civic duty to stand for election, to serve on councils, and to use their wealth, much like the Roman state, to build themselves into legitimacy. They were expected to construct amphitheaters, city streets, temples, things of that nature. This is the system of civic evergetism. It enabled the Roman state to operate with what we today would understand to be a small central government. Under this system, cities flourished, but it did not last. In the 3rd century, there were a series of civil wars, plagues, and incursions from Rome's neighbors on the frontiers, the so-called barbarians, as well as the Persian Empire. Collectively, this is what is known as the 3rd century crisis. Territory was lost, cities shrank in size, and the population did decline. By the time the Roman Empire got back on its feet, the state had strengthened significantly, and both the nature and function of the aristocracy and the cities had fundamentally changed in order to respond to these challenges. The historian Guy Halsall, in his book Barbarian Migrations in the Roman West, 376 to 568, writes the following. Administratively, the basic building block of the empire remained the civitas, the city district, although there were some modifications to these. More important changes took place at higher levels. The provinces were drastically reduced in size to make their government easier, and their number doubled, eventually to 114. This obviously raised some cities to the status of provincial capitals. Other towns declined in relative importance. The provinces were then grouped into dioceses, each ruled by a vicarius, and by an uneven process during the reigns of Constantine I and his sons, the dioceses were in turn grouped into praetorian prefectures. There were 2 in the regions that concern us, Gaul and Italy. Rome remained as the urban prefecture. All the rulers of these different regions had their own administrative staffs. Atop this administrative pyramid stood the emperor and his palatine officials. At the court were located the officials of the bedchamber, the financial ministries, the corps of notaries, the imperial writing offices, the agentes and rebus, and so on. These totaled a veritable army, especially when added to the imperial bodyguards. Lactantius and other writers bemoaned the ever-increasing number of bureaucrats, and understandably. The late Roman imperial service has been estimated at between 25,000 and 35,000 men. The growth in the number of provinces, the institution of 2 intermediate administrative levels between them and the emperor, and above all, the uncoupling of military and civil service, effectively ended the danger of revolt from provincial governors. The separation of the 2 branches of imperial service was especially important. Henceforth, governors would not command troops within their territories, and military commanders would not control the supply of food and pay to their soldiers. Furthermore, military districts like the Saxon Shore or the Tractus Armoricanus no longer corresponded to civil administrative units. The importance of rank, status, and precedence in the later Roman world cannot be overestimated. Traditionally, there had been only 2 aristocratic orders, the equestrian and the senatorial. Constantine added a third, the comitiva, the emperor's companions, in other words, those who had risen through imperial service. The equestrian order was divided into grades of precedence, the egregi, the prefectissimi, and the eminentissimi. The senatorial order had originally been made up simply of clarissimi. The comitiva was subdivided into 3 grades. Within all groups were complex rules of precedence depending upon whether a rank had been bestowed personally by the emperor or in absentia, or whether an honoris actually held a requisite office or had been bestowed an honorary title, such as ex vicarius. Imperial service brought entry into the equestrian order, or the comitiva, and as the 4th century progressed, the inflation of honors set in so that offices that had carried equestrian status brought senatorial rank. The equestrian order and the comitiva were devalued, and the former more or less disappeared. The senatorial order expanded so that extra honorific grades had to be created. The spectabiles, the illustres, and the gloriosi. Eventually, the rank of clarissimus became a mere title. A leading senator's son was automatically a clarissimus, but he needed to serve in the higher echelons of imperial service at any time, and at the higher levels, most were not held for more than a year or 2. By the end of the 4th century, command of a regiment or the governorship of a province brought entry into the clarissimate. It has been estimated that about 3,000 jobs per generation in each half of the empire brought senatorial status. Some aristocrats possessed enormous wealth, but this meant little in politics, even within their class, without the imperial service that guaranteed an honorific title and a higher place in precedence. Furthermore, traditional Roman aristocratic culture required periods, however brief, of service between spells of otium on one's estates. The bureaucracy, moreover, provided aristocrats with opportunities to exercise their own patronage by placing people in post within it, even when themselves not serving the state in an official capacity. As Averil Cameron has stated, the 4th century witnessed the transformation of the old orders, still closely linked to birth and wealth, into a service aristocracy in which rank depended upon office. The precise way in which this linked regional elites into the empire varied. In some areas, an aristocrat would, in local or regional socioeconomic terms, have been an aristocrat with or without the existence of the empire and its offices. In others, it might have been the opportunities provided by imperial service that raised an individual or his family above the others in the locality. These variations made the empire a socially and politically more variegated entity than is often appreciated, and are decisive in explaining the fate of different regions in the 5th century and later. Continuing a trend begun during the 3rd century, the emperors adopted a more autocratic governmental style. They also moved the political core of the empire to the geographical periphery. Through the reigns of Maximian, Constantine and his sons, of the usurper Magnentius, of Julian as Caesar in Gaul, and into those of Valentinian I and Gratian, the emperor was to be found, as often as not, in the far north of Gaul at Trier, or on the Rhine-Danube frontier itself. The other imperial capitals were places like Sirmium in Pannonia and Antioch in the east. Even the great new city of Constantinople was indicative of this trend. This made much strategic sense. There was a great deal of movement within the enormous pyramid of interlocking patronage networks that was the bureaucracy, and thus a vast store of patronage for the emperors, their higher officials, and powerful noblemen to acquire, distribute, and redistribute. The problem which should be stressed was that although the system served effectively to bind the different regions of the Western Empire back into a single political unit, and thus replaced early Roman municipal service and competition comparatively well, it was nevertheless somewhat passive. Early Roman regional elites worked to associate themselves with the empire. The interest in imperial service lay in what the empire could provide. Put another way, in the late Roman Empire, aristocrats ceased to ask what they could do for their empire, and instead increasingly asked what their empire could do for them. So, a rather extended quote, but it sums up the changes to the government in response to the 3rd century crisis rather well. These alterations to Roman social structure and the role of the aristocracy in the late Roman Empire not only strengthened the government and enabled it to respond more effectively to the challenges of late antiquity, it also profoundly affected the cities, and this is where we get to the Roman economy. The single factor which defines the economy of the Roman Empire, more than anything else, especially in late antiquity, is the easy transport of bulk goods. These are things like olive oil, wine, flax, lumber, brick, and of course, pottery. There are essentially two views that scholars take on the Roman economy. There is the primitivist view, which holds that the Roman economy was fundamentally different than ours, and there is the modernist or substantivist view, which argues the opposite, essentially that for all the differences which exist between then and now, the economy of ancient Rome was fundamentally like ours today. Over the past several decades, the modernist view has largely won out, and that is because the economy of ancient Rome was, like the one we are so familiar with today, an economy driven largely by markets and prices. Our surviving sources, not only textual but also material, that is, archaeological, paint a pretty clear picture. Rome's economy, especially in late antiquity, was market-based and saw intensive rationalism all across the empire. Some regions produced vast amounts of olives and olive oil, other places produced wine, other places produced finished goods, and there are plenty of archaeological remains of pottery factories, for instance. There was also a healthy mix of large estates run by aristocrats which engaged in the production of one or two goods, like olive oil, and smaller farms run by families which exist up until the end of the 5th century, or, in Italy, until the end of the 6th century, but by and large, it was the big estates of the wealthy which were characteristic of the Roman market economy, especially in late antiquity. Both cities and the Roman state and the security which the state provided were heavily intertwined, and it's basically impossible to understand one without the other for this particular subject. Roman cities functioned as economic nodes and regional centers for the transport of low-value bulk goods, and they functioned as centers of tax collection. The Roman state, essentially through the military, provided wide-ranging security and built and maintained the famous road network of the Roman Empire to enable its armies to travel across Roman territory. That security enabled costs for these goods to be relatively low because there was no fear of goods being stolen, and it is that security and the ease of transport which knit the Roman world together so tightly. The state also provided a system of insurance and contract law which private merchants could use to insure their own business ventures against any sort of a potential loss, much like we have today. And then, spanning the Mediterranean Sea and connecting all of the coastal cities and towns, were shipping lanes, which were absolutely crucial to the Roman economy for the following reason. The Roman Empire was, to paraphrase historian Chris Wickham, united by the tax system that funded everything from the military to road systems to ports to the procurement of bulk goods for the military and for the Annona system, which is essentially how large cities in classical antiquity were able to feed themselves. It's a slightly different idea, but you basically see the same sort of thing in Han China as regards rice to feed the cities. Now, in order to move the tax, both in money and in kind, where that was applicable, the Roman state subsidized private shipping, a group of merchants called navicularii. Essentially, the way the system worked was that the state contracted out a specified amount of tonnage on the ships to carry the goods or money, coins do take up space after all, and these merchants would then travel to the specified city to bring the tax. Once that was done, they could travel anywhere else they wanted, but what this does, essentially, is it enables bulk goods that were not part of the tax system to reach the cities with low transaction costs, because the cost of moving the ship and everything on it was partially subsidized by the Roman state. Goods were cheap, is the main idea here. To sum everything up then, what are we looking at? Well, the Roman economy was agrarian at its base, and much of its day-to-day functioning was predicated upon the supply and demand principle, where low-value goods, produced and traded in high quantities across vast distances, traveled along roads and shipping routes maintained by the Roman state for military use, by a mix of government officials, private merchants, and individuals who operated in both worlds, backed by complex legal systems and financed by bank loans, because the Romans had a fairly sophisticated system of banking, utilizing a revitalized money economy. We should be very clear here that there was a decline in late antiquity from the empire's population peak circa AD 200, perhaps as much as 15 or 20% of a decline. But while there were less people comparatively speaking, the 4th century was one of renewed construction all across the Roman world, and the introduction of new coinage drastically increased the monetization of the economy, especially because much of the new coinage was based in gold, with silver as a secondary. The result was that the Roman world of late antiquity was far more deeply integrated than it was during the Augustan era, and this new aristocracy which I talked about at the start of this video, because they were so deeply tied to the Roman government and the economy, were able to take advantage of this drastic upsurge in monetization. The result, long term, was that the basis of wealth shifted in late antiquity from land to physical money. Infrastructure expanded and was repaired in order to facilitate the movement of bulk goods all across the Roman world. Kyle Harper sums it up like this: "The monetary restoration revived the financial sector. The great banks of the Roman Empire had all but vanished with the crash of the silver money regime, but in the 4th century they came back to life. The evidence for credit and banking in the 4th century exceeds that for any period of Roman history. Nothing from antiquity can match in vividness the priest John Chrysostom's portrait of the deposit bankers of Antioch at work in his day. Credit markets fueled capital investment and underwrote mercantile ventures. They turned the wheels of commerce. The merchant who wants to get rich prepares a ship, hires sailors, summons a captain, and does all the other things necessary to set sail, and borrows money and tries the sea, and passes into foreign lands. The revival of money and credit reawakened commercial networks across the Mediterranean. St. Augustine, in his port town of Hippo, evoked the allure of the trading life. Sailing and trading, another says, that's great. It's great to know many provinces, make money everywhere, not to be beholden in town to some mighty man, to always travel in foreign lands and nourish the mind on a variety of business and nations, and then come home, rich with profits. There isn't any reason really to suppose that the Roman Empire would have fallen in the 5th century if things had not gone awry. Indeed, some historians view the 4th century as the high point of the empire, with the crucial difference being that in the eastern half, the cities and urban elites were more important to the functioning of the state, while in the western half of the empire, which is typically what people mean when they refer to the fall of Rome, the service aristocracy, at home on their big estates and engaged in the pursuit of profit, for which the cities were so key, were the more important factor in imperial governance. So what happened? Well, it's not population collapse, it seems to be a combination of political intrigue distracting the Roman court from military events, and a rather severe blow to this heavily interconnected economy. Everyone watching this video is probably familiar, in some fashion, with the barbarian invasions of late antiquity. There is not really a one-size-fits-all answer for how this occurred. There is at least one known instance of what we would consider to be mass migration or an invasion, and this is the crossing of the Danube by some of the Goths in 376. The Angles, Saxons, and Utes probably fit into this scheme as well, but while there were large-scale population movements across the Channel to the British Isles, it was drawn out over maybe 2 centuries, whereas the Goths crossed possibly as many as 50,000 people in one go. What concerns us here for the end of the Western Empire are the Vandals. The date has been debated. It's either 405 or 406, although an extremely good article by the historian Michael Kolakowski does argue for 406, but no matter which year you pick, a large group of barbarians, including Sueves and Vandals, crossed the Rhine, supposedly because it was so cold that winter that the Rhine had frozen over. We know extremely little about this. There are, and I am not exaggerating, like 3 sources for this event, one of which is just a line in a larger text, but they appear to have stayed in Gaul for up to 3 years, and then, possibly by as late as 409, they crossed into Iberia. The Visigoths, who were Roman allies by this point and who largely comprised the military in southern Gaul, follow them into Iberia, and they defeat these groups in several battles. Over the course of the 420s, the situation flips and the Vandals and the Sueves are able to defeat forces sent against them, and they are secure in southern Iberia. Between 425 and 429, the Western Roman court was riven with political intrigue, almost on a Game of Thrones type of level. This results in the Western government being distracted, and taking advantage of that distraction, the Vandals, led by their king Gaiseric, at some point during these 4 years, crossed the Strait of Gibraltar and they successfully invade and conquer much of North Africa. Both halves of the Roman Empire launched several campaigns to retake North Africa in the 5th century, but this does not ever work. The loss of Iberia and North Africa is what, in the long term, does in the Western Roman Empire, although the effects are not felt all at once. The reason for this, essentially, is that Iberia and North Africa formed the spine of the tax system, which enabled everything else to function, and once this spine was snapped, the Western Roman Empire just basically starts hemorrhaging money. One of the methods by which the state could get troops for the military was by requesting the aristocracy to send peasants tied to their vast estates for a period of military service. However, those same aristocrats could get out of this by sending a certain amount of money to the state in exchange for keeping the peasants on their land. After the loss of Iberia and North Africa over the next few decades, requests for troops from these estates increase, but it's not actually to get soldiers, it's done in an attempt to get money to offset the losses of the tax system. This was so crucial to the functioning of the Roman state that even as late as 471, the government was trying to figure out how to retake Iberia to recover at least a portion of that tax system. As all of this is happening, 2 things begin occurring in increasing frequency. The first is government coups, which decrease political stability. The second thing is the settling of barbarian troops, whom we don't really have much of a reason to think of as being disloyal to the Roman state. Hugh Elton wrote a whole book on this in the 90s. And these troops are being settled in various places in Western territory where they are promised something called thirds. The Visigoths are the first to have this occur. We don't know when exactly, but it's probably around 419. It's not entirely clear what thirds refers to, but the major argument put forth by a historian named Walter Goffart is that it doesn't refer to a third of land, but rather to a third of a region's tax revenue, which would have gone to the military after being allocated by the central government. In light of all the problems Rome was facing, settling the military in a region just cuts out the middleman, that is to say, the central Roman government. The military is able to just collect it from the surrounding area. So what this then leads to is a general breakdown in the economy of the Western Empire. The shipping lanes are disrupted, the easy movement of bulk goods disappear, and the cities gradually begin shrinking or are actually abandoned. Things fall into disrepair and they aren't fixed, and local fighting begins to increase. Those aristocrats who I talked about at the start of this video and the military stop needing the Western Empire as a political entity, and local ties between them and the population gradually become more important, eventually leading to what the historian Peter Brown, probably the Dean of Late Antiquity, calls in his book The Rise of Western Christendom the development of localized Romes. And with the destruction of the tax spine, and with it the gradual decay of the Roman economy, by the time the barbarian Odovaker overthrew Romulus Augustulus and sent the imperial regalia to the eastern court at Constantinople, there was not a need for an emperor in the west anymore. One emperor in the east would suffice. The loss of North Africa, due to political infighting and the distractions they caused, was an accident which came on top of hundreds of wounds suffered by the Roman state, as the emperors and the military attempted to put the state back together again. And Guy Halsall sums up the paradox of Rome's fall like this. 4 years after Romulus's deposition, in 480, evidently while plotting a campaign to restore his authority in Italy, Julius Nepos was murdered by 2 retainers, apparently at the instigation of the Bishop of Salona, that same Glycerius whom he had deposed and driven into the church 6 years earlier, and Odovaker took over Dalmatia. With his assassination, the empire in the west finally came to an end. It is, as often been noted, more than a little ironic that his last 2 rulers shared names with the first king of Rome, Romulus, and if not the first emperor, then the founder of the first imperial dynasty, Julius. The most ironic thing of all, however, is that during the preceding century it is almost impossible to identify a single figure who had actually tried to cause its demise. All the decisive acts in bringing down the empire were carried out by people attempting to create a better position for themselves within the sorts of imperial structures that had existed in the 4th century. In a famous dictum, Andreas Pijanol wrote that Roman civilization did not die a natural death, it was assassinated. Neither alternative seems correct. The Roman Empire was not murdered, nor did it die a natural death. It accidentally committed suicide.
If going home for the holidays isn't what it used to be, it's time to go.
Capital One hooked me up with rewards. I didn't even have.
In the 13th century, a remarkable manuscript was penned in Wales. Within the book, a very unusual story managed to escape the fate of almost all other historical texts, and was successfully preserved all the way to the present day. While anything surviving over 700 years is an achievement, such as my homunculus that the government recently told me to destroy, this is nothing compared to where this story may have killed us that the government recently told me to bring over 700 years is an achievement, such as my homunculus that the government recently told me to destroy. This is nothing compared to where this story may have come from. In this tale from medieval Wales, we're told about the exploits of a gigantic king named Bran the Blessed. About halfway through the story, he and his men go across the Irish Sea to rescue his sister from an abusive marriage. And while we wouldn't expect a man the size of a mountain to have much difficulty swimming across the water, we are told it was particularly easy back then, because the sea was much narrower. Instead of a wide, deep body of water, we're told that at this time, the Irish Sea was instead significantly shallower, and composed of only 2 rivers. Several historians have looked at this and made a suggestion that, if true, would be incredibly remarkable. That the story of Bran the Blessed, the ancient king of Britain, may contain a memory dating all the way back to the last ice age. The only question is, how ancient is this really? Did the medieval Welsh genuinely preserve a memory from thousands of years prior? And is this the only occurrence of such a story? The tale we're interested in is found in a collection known today as the Mabinogion. In this story, Bran's sister married the King of Ireland. However, their relationship soon soured because the king's men would not stop bringing up the insult he faced when he was in Wales. Apparently, if one of your brothers-in-law removes the eyelids from your horses, you just can't let it go. Despite being given compensation, the king decided the insult was too great and punished his wife, who had nothing to do with it instead. Upon finally hearing word of this, King Bran assembled an army from all across Britain and sailed for Ireland. On the opposite shore, some of the Irish king's swineherds were looking out to sea and soon rushed back to report a spectacular sight. "My lord," they cried, "we've seen a most extraordinary sight. There is a forest in the ocean where there were no forests before." Certainly a strange sight to see, but that wasn't everything, as we're also told there was a mountain accompanying it, with a high ridge and 2 lakes, one on each side. And to top it all off, this new landscape was not stationary, but instead moving straight towards them. The King of Ireland assumed, rightfully to be fair, that his wife would know what was going on, and she revealed the meaning behind this new, frightening sight. She told them that there was no forest, that the trees were instead thousands of masts belonging to the ships carrying the army from the whole of Great Britain, and that there was no mountain. The rock face instead belongs to her brother, the giant King Bran. The ridge was his nose, the lakes were his eyes, and he was furiously staring right at the shores of Ireland. I won't go into the entire story in this video, but to sum it up, Bran's army manages to defeat the Irish in a pretty typical medieval way. Can you guess what it was? Was it A, through chivalrous acts of bravery and daring? Was it B, through cunning tactics and superior military planning? Or was it C, by finding out that the Irish are raising an army of resurrected mute soldiers by throwing their dead into a small cauldron, so the man that mutilated the horses and caused this whole mess in the first place throws himself in the cauldron and stretches out his arms and legs so that the cauldron explodes and now the Welsh can defeat the Irish and rescue Bran's sister? Yes, it's C. But while I think this story is brilliant, what we're really interested in today is the description of the giant king crossing the Irish Sea. Due to his size, he wasn't able to fit in any boat, but that's okay, as we're told, quote, "Bran and his army sailed towards Ireland, and the sea was not wide then. Bran waded across. There were only 2 rivers, called the Lly and the Archan. Later, the sea spread out when it flooded the kingdoms." Bran apparently, fascinatingly, had no trouble simply walking across. Of course, if he was the size of a mountain, we wouldn't expect it to be very hard, but the story shares with us the incredible detail of the sea being narrower and shallower back then, and that it only later expanded. And what's so fascinating about a 13th century manuscript containing this detail is that it's true. 12,000 years ago, the Earth looked very different. Australia had grown to be even bigger, Florida had actually begun to fight back against the ocean, the North was covered in sheets of ice, and according to this map, the USSR still existed. This was the Pleistocene, also known as the Ice Age, although looking at this map now, that actually seems to be inappropriate. Regardless, a key fact makes itself known to us. The sea levels were indeed lower back then than they are now, as the popular chemical hydrogen oxide took its parents' advice and left its preferred liquid role to take on a new, more solid career. But as the Earth began to warm and the ice began to melt, humanity would have witnessed what we now call the Holocene marine transgression, making it sound like the ocean itself was fighting us. Plenty of land was lost during this transgression. The island of Man was once connected to Great Britain and was presumably just called the Man back then, but about 9,000 years ago the ocean finally decided to give it its namesake. About 8,000 years ago, probably one of the most famous examples of this occurred, as we lost the peats and marshes of Doggerland, the land bridge that connected Britain and Europe. And finally, we can see this damage off the western coast of Wales. The historians Haslett and Willis, analysing underwater maps of this area, note that south of the town of Aberystwyth, the sea seems to randomly deepen in a long, narrow channel, indicating that at some point, one of the rivers that empty out at Aberystwyth today would have once instead travelled southwards, along the now submerged soil. And to the north of this underwater riverbed, we can also see three unusual structures known as the Sarni. San Badrig, Sarna Buch, and San Cynfelen are three long stone scars across the ocean, left behind by glacial deposits. They're mostly submerged nowadays, but you can still see them at low tide, and I find their construction oddly unsettling. Silent stone walls, not built by man but by colossal sheets of ice, rapidly descending into the water and stretching for miles underneath. So then, we can now see why historians such as John Davis are excited over the mention of Bran crossing a sea that was shallower in the past, because the Irish Sea really was shallower in the past. As he puts it, these stories, quote, may represent very ancient folk memories of these changes. Of course, we don't know exactly when this story was supposed to take place, or when these memories could potentially be from. All the tale tells us is that the Irish Sea was composed of two rivers back then, which were presumably connected since you could apparently sail across them, and that body of water was narrower than today. We don't know how ancient these folk memories could be, but as we've seen from the examples of Doggerland and the Isle of Man, if this story does indeed have roots on this era, then it would be thousands of years old. Now of course, I know what you're thinking. Mr. Chronicles, who's that at my window? And well, of course, no one can answer that. I can answer a different question. Are there any more examples of this? Is this story of Bran really the only memory surviving this long, turbulent time? Well, do you remember the rest of that quote? After the part about the sea being narrower and composed of two rivers, later the sea spread out when it flooded the kingdoms. I wonder what that's about. Before we start the video, I would like to thank today's sponsor, you. As we speak, 200,000 American dollars are being transferred out of your account, and this is the Goth map, the earliest map we have of just the island of Great Britain. Quite a specific qualifier, but interesting nonetheless. Gone were the days of Ptolemy butchering Scotland. Instead, these map makers had full access to England and their newly conquered Wales, giving us a remarkable historical insight into the landscape at the time. Of course, in standing with tradition, Scotland wasn't quite drawn as good as the rest of the island, but at least it's upright this time. But what's really amazing about the Goth map is something that I often find is the case with historical topics. Sure, the broad picture can be interesting, but the truly fascinating aspects are always in the tiniest details. Single poems preserving the memory of long destroyed kingdoms, paragraphs accidentally becoming the only record of churches that once dominated the landscape. And in this case, a colossal map, a massive undertaking, the first of its kind, that accidentally preserved the existence of two small, featureless islands in Ceredigion Bay. Islands today that no longer exist. Islands that, seemingly by the 16th century, no longer existed. Ceredigion Bay is a large, oddly shallow stretch of the Irish Sea. If you were really tall, you'd be able to stand up straight in it and touch the floor, although technically that could be true for any body of water on Earth. But this bay really is surprisingly shallow. Around the Sinai, there are broad tracts of sand that only reach a depth of about 10 meters, and for several miles out to sea, the depth only reaches a measly 20. So it's perhaps not surprising then that Wales, and particularly this region, are home to several stories of ancient kingdoms being lost beneath the waves. I made a whole video tracing the origins, millennia of cross-referencing and mistakes that came with these stories, so for now I'll keep it straightforward. The most famous of these tales is Cantref Gwaelod, the lowland or deep Cantref, the medieval Welsh equivalent of a county. Once ruled by a man named Gwyddno, this low-lying tract was one day overrun by the waves after a woman named Mererid released the Fury of the Sea after a feast, with the implication being it was her job to keep the waters at bay. Various versions of the story penned throughout the history of Wales tell us different details, but the broad strokes remain the same. Gwyddno ruled a kingdom vulnerable to the sea, and one day the raging waves rolled over and sank his lands. Poets and antiquarians would then pass this story down to us, with some blaming the wave on divine intervention and others simply acknowledging the tale. John Leyland in the 16th century remarked that this Cantref Gwaelod had been cleanly devoured by the ocean, and Robert Vaughan in the 17th century mentions the large plain between the counties of Carnarvon, Cardigan and Pembroke, long since swallowed by the sea, and that Sarn Badrig was the remnant of its long flooded wall. My favourite mention of this sunken kingdom by far though has to be in the 16th century, when a poet named Lewis mentions the sinking of Gwyddno's land and castle during an elegy for some reason. I guess to try and lighten the mood? But while Gwyddno was associated with a flooding of seemingly most of Ceredigion Bay, other kings would be given much smaller territories in their stories. One example is Teithi Hen, ruler of Ynys Teithi Hen. This self-centered island was said to have been destroyed by the sea too, but in this case it sounds a lot more sudden and violent. We're told that no one, man or animal, escaped except for Teithi Hen and his horse, and that the whole experience left the old king traumatized for the rest of his life. He briefly appears in a medieval Arthurian tale known as Cilwch ac Olwen, where we're told that another curse has befallen him. Every time he tried to use a knife, the handle would fall off, resulting in him slowly starving to death. This guy really couldn't catch a break, or just use a spoon. In the longer video I made about these kingdoms, I hypothesized that one of these lost islands could have been Ynys Teithi Hen, as they fit the admittedly very narrow criteria, but we really can't be certain about that. Moving north slightly, we have a king named Helig ap Glanog. His story has been extremely mixed up with that of Cantref Gwaelod, to the point that we basically have stories giving the same tract of land two different names and two different kings, but by the 15th and 16th centuries he was firmly associated with lands lost to the sea in North Wales. Specifically, an area known as Traeth Helig off the coast of Ynys Môn and Ynys Glanog, making him the second king to seemingly have an island named after him. Although unlike Teithi Hen, Helig's island actually still exists, albeit under a different name. Take that, Teithi Hen. I bet Helig could use cutlery too. In the Triads, we're told that his land was good, fertile and level, an excellent bit of foreshadowing in a triad about the kingdoms that the sea destroyed, and that it was also ultimately lost to the waves. Even further north, out of Wales entirely, we have the enigmatic lands of Redvoy ap Rheged. While this name and Helig's mean they were the sons of a man named Rheged or Glanog, it also could potentially suggest a location. As we saw with Helig, his story soon became associated around the island that bore his alleged father's name, so could this be the case for Redvoy too? Rheged was a Brythonic kingdom around modern-day Cumbria, which could suggest that he lost lands to the sea in this region. As I mentioned earlier, about 9,000 years ago the Isle of Man was connected to Great Britain, giving us a very large area to potentially place the lost lands of Redvoy. Finally, as I've already mentioned, we also have stories from the Isle of Man. These tales include the island once being larger, of lands appearing and disappearing off the coast, of fishermen hearing the sounds of sheep and bells under the waves, and my personal favourite, of the southern tip of Scotland once being only a stone's throw away from the island. As the historian Patrick Nunn points out, the distance between these 2 points is 40 kilometres, a little less than 25 miles today. So that story either involves the people of the Isle of Man being extremely good at throwing stones, or of the sea levels once being much lower, allowing the two land masses to be closer together. In all, these stories seem to preserve a tantalizingly old memory of a time when these lands were inhabited by men instead of fish. Some of these lands were lost to the waves slowly, others violently. Some seem to actively hold back the water for a time, while others have had nothing survive except their alleged ruler's name. So, in the end, what does this all mean? The stories surrounding the Sumerian figure of Gilgamesh are considered by some to be the oldest recorded tales in the world. It is for that reason that I think the very lengthily titled Gilgamesh, Enkidu and the Netherworld is one of the most fascinating ancient stories of all time, because it begins like this. In those days, in those ancient days, in those nights, in those remote nights, in those years, in those distant years. One of the oldest recorded stories in all of human history starts off with a callback to an even older time. A time when heaven and earth were separated from each other, a time before their people had tasted bread, two apparently equally ancient concepts. So next time someone says that something is the best thing since sliced bread, tell them to try saying the best thing since the separation of heaven and earth instead. It is impossible to know if the story of Bran the Blessed really did preserve an ancient memory that would be thousands of years old. You might think that it's downright impossible for that to even be the case, but it's not the only example. As we've seen, there are several stories in Wales about lands being lost to the waves, but they aren't the only ones. We've seen tales from the Isle of Man about a time when the island was larger and closer to Scotland. If Redvoy was connected to Rheged, then we have a lost story about the land around Cumbria being sunk beneath the ocean. This isn't even mentioning the tales from outside of Britain entirely. Hazlitt and Willis, for example, mention stories from the Aboriginal people of Australia, recalling a time where two land masses separated by water were once joined, or when people once waded and swam across water that would be too distant to swim across today. I don't want to portray this as a foregone conclusion, however, because not everyone agrees. Even Hazlitt and Willis, who support the idea of Bran's story containing elements of this ancient folk memory, don't believe Cantrell Gwaelod contains the same elements. They suggest that the sudden destructive wave sounds less like a thousands of years long process and perhaps more of a sudden storm or tsunami. Ultimately speaking, we cannot know the origins of these stories. We can't know if Bran the Blessed crossing the sea thousands of years ago, before it expanded and flooded the kingdoms, when it was shallower and narrower than before, really does recall a time when that was indeed true, or if this is all just a coincidence, a lucky guess, or just a plot device a bard once thought of, not knowing that thousands of years prior, the sea really would have looked like how they imagined it. I think the historian John Davis said it best, that these stories may represent very ancient folk memories of these changes. But if that's correct, then this corner of Britain may have just barely preserved a really ancient and important piece of human history. This detail barely takes up a paragraph in the Mabinogion. Cantrell Gwaelod's oldest incarnations are similarly short. Helig ap Glanog's tale is regularly confused with the former, and we have lost whatever story Redvoy ap Rheged took part in. And that's to say nothing of the memories that have been forgotten entirely. Were there once stories of a land lost off the eastern coast of England? Were there once memories of men and women who slowly witnessed the land they walked across sink further and further below the waves? I think we can safely say that these stories probably did exist once, but like Doggerland, have sunk out of history. In 2023, scientists from the UK managed to map several ancient sunken rivers in this area and figured out whether they drain towards the North Sea or towards the newly forming English Channel. We can actually map these lands that fell beneath the waves thousands and thousands of years ago. We can chart the courses of the rivers that flow through here. We can see whether they drain to the north or the south. We can see that about 14,000 years ago, peat began to form here, and that about 4,000 years later, the now narrow low land bridge had turned into a salt marsh. Scientists can and have calculated all of this, but we can never bring back what is lost. We call this place Doggerland because that's the best name we have for it. We don't have an equivalent of Cantrell Gwaelod, Traeth Helig, the Sea or the Archan. That's gone. Whatever the people who lived here, who walked across here called it, is gone, and it's never coming back. Whatever stories they may have told about this place or its ultimate destruction are gone. and we have seemingly no hope of ever hearing them again. I hope you can see why then people are excited over the Mabinogion possibly preserving a piece of history from this time, because so much of it has been lost and will continue to stay lost forever. We can look below the waves, we can chart the rivers, map the lakes, study the soil, but we cannot look into the past. Time and time again, almost everything is lost. Unless an anonymous monk in the 13th century writes down a story, one that had been passed down an untold number of generations, one that may be just possibly accidentally preserved in a single tiny paragraph, what has the potential to be one of the oldest stories in the world. Thank you for watching. In the 7th century, a lone monk is approached by a man on horseback. This is an envoy of the king, and he bears terrible news. The Anglo-Saxons of England have invaded the kingdom, and it looks like its ruler will soon be dispossessed and the land overrun. But this envoy didn't come to warn the monk or to tell him to flee. Instead, he came to request his assistance. Because this man was no ordinary monk with a lifelong commitment to the church. He didn't join the abbey in his youth, but instead as an old man after a lifetime of ruling this kingdom. Because this man was the former king, a ruler who we're told struck fear into his enemies and was capable of making them flee merely at the sight of him. Having relinquished temporal power in favor of seeking that of the eternal, he gave his lands over to his son, and now it was falling apart. But he didn't go with the envoy. Those days were behind him. Most men born into his position only renounced their possessions through death, but he did so voluntarily. It would be hard to convince him to return from that. But this wasn't the end. This man's name was Teodrig, and he would be commemorated as a king, a saint, and forebodingly as a martyr. Despite this, very little is known about him, and what we do have isn't fully reliable. This is the mystery of the martyred king. The kingdoms of South Wales, Glywysing and Gwent are very enigmatic. Their royal lines cross, overlap and diverge constantly, reflecting a centuries-long history of uniting and breaking apart. They would eventually be fused into one distinct entity under a king named Morgan, becoming the creatively named Morgannwg, but according to genealogies compiled in the 9th century, our King Teodrig was the origin point for all of this. During his rule and the centuries preceding it, the Anglo-Saxon controlled kingdoms had gradually made incursions into the land ruled by the Celtic Britons. In the 6th century, they successfully besieged 3 cities just across the sea from Teodrig's kingdom, and by the time of his rule they had apparently reached his doorstep. According to his own legend, he faced the Anglo-Saxons in battle many times, and each time he emerged victorious to the point that his enemies were turned to flight just at the sight of his face. So of course, with all of this, he was clearly the perfect man for the job. The founder of the kingdom, a monarch undefeated in battle. When his enemies returned in full force, presumably happy to finally not be running in fear from him, his son, the king, desperately needed his help. As we've seen, however, he turned him down. Much like how my son would be the perfect chimney sweep, Teodrig was beset by a terrible condition known as "I don't want to do that." We can imagine him returning peacefully to his abbey once the envoy had left, drifting off to sleep while his son had to be told that he was on his own, with his destruction rapidly approaching. However, waking up in a cold sweat, Teodrig could soon hear a voice, and something moving in his room. An angel. Arousing him from his slumber, and presumably after hearing Teodrig wouldn't help his own son, the angel took a different approach. Do it because I said so. And yeah, that probably would have been quite persuasive even if you weren't a monk. To give Teodrig credit, the angel didn't simply just tell him to go, instead they told him exactly what was going to happen. They told him that the next day he would arm himself, go to the ford north of the abbey and stand in battle once again. The Saxons, seeing the face of the undefeated king reappearing, would turn to flee out of the kingdom and not return for 30 years. That sounds pretty good, and I'm sure Teodrig would have been persuaded by the knowledge that after one last appearance he'd never have to fight again in his lifetime. However, The Welsh have an odd, old tradition. Within the poetry and manuscripts of early medieval Wales, we can find occasional references to men being defeated in battle and buried, and upon their burial, their bones would apparently protect the area from invasion. Tewdrig may have been familiar with these stories, and if he was, then his lands being protected for 30 years may have sounded too good to be true. And indeed, before the angel departed, it had one final thing to say. During this encounter, Tewdrig would be destined to be struck with a single blow, and he would die 3 days later. His reputation alone wouldn't scare off the invaders, even if he was undefeated. Instead, this protection would be sourced from his bones. With that, the angel departed, leaving Tewdrig alone. He, a newly made man of God, had just been sent a messenger from above telling him to defend his kingdom once again. That would be like your new boss sending you an email telling you to go help out at your old job. Except most bosses won't tell you exactly when and how you're going to die. Tewdrig prepared to leave the next morning. His son's army soon arrived, and we're told that Tewdrig cheerfully went with them. They marched north to the ford of the River Gwy, or Wye, and waited for the Anglo-Saxons. The arrival of Tewdrig's son sounds like a great coincidence, or perhaps the king reaching out for help one last time. However, we're told that the battle was to take place at the ford just north of Tintern Abbey where Tewdrig lived, so yes, that means that the envoy likely told him that the invaders were approaching his house, and he still opted to stay home. The Anglo-Saxon force soon emerged, but they weren't expecting Tewdrig, the king they had faced so many times and lost to over and over again. And just as the angel said, the invading army then turned and fled. But the angel had been right about one more thing. As their enemies had turned to run, one of the Anglo-Saxon soldiers threw his lance at the Welsh. Arcing across the ford, it met Tewdrig's body and wounded him with a single strike. His son sent his army onward and pursued the Saxons all the way to a place known as Pwll Brochwel, a location that has now been lost to us, and returned to his father with the spoils of war. We're told, however, that these treasures didn't matter to Tewdrig, because he had already rejoiced as if spoil had been taken from a vanquished enemy. It had happened exactly as he'd been told, and in 3 days' time he would exchange his life for the safety of his kingdom. He requested to be buried on an island off the coast, Ynys Echni, and in the next morning a chariot had arrived, apparently being pulled by 2 stags. They very slowly travelled south towards the coast over the next few days, but Tewdrig would never look at the sea, nor that island. He didn't have enough time. Instead, they came to a meadow where a clear spring flowed, and the former king commanded the stags to leave him. There, alone, he died. Tewdrig the king had become Tewdrig the martyr, and the name of his church, Merthyr Tewdrig, reflects this, constructed on the spot where it is said that he fulfilled his destiny. Tewdrig's story is found within a text known as the Book of Llandav, a manuscript covering the history and land ownership of an important diocese in South Wales. Can you guess which one? A lot of elements are muddied within this, and the religious overtones of this story are hopefully very obvious. Coupled with this, the last page of this tale is essentially dedicated to the Diocese of Llandav telling us how Tewdrig's son gave them lots of land, and telling the Normans that they should really respect these ancient agreements. So of course, plenty of details surrounding Tewdrig are very likely to be altered, and that's not even accounting for the 14 centuries between his time and ours. He probably wasn't pulled by a chariot of stags that made fountains wherever they came to rest, but if the locations of the battle and his church are to be trusted, then someone moved him south. He may not have literally made his enemies flee from sight alone, but it does seem like a king of South Wales stopped the Anglo-Saxon advance at the Gwy. According to the National Library of Wales, the Book of Llandav was made to strengthen the diocese's ecclesiastical rights and territories. So it's no wonder that a third of this 3-page story is dedicated to how Tewdrig's son created the church and gave all the lands to Llandav, with a boundary so specific it takes over 170 words to describe, and that anyone who tries to alter this will be cursed forever. The same specifications I have if anyone tries to add my son to my will. But what I find interesting is that Tewdrig's story is entirely irrelevant to this. He was already a prominent king, the alleged founder of the kingdom. We don't need the story of his martyrdom to justify his son giving away these lands. In fact, we barely need Tewdrig at all. And maybe it's just wishful thinking, but I believe that adds a lot of credibility to his story. It seems like the diocese drew on a pre-existing story to add an ancient claim to their ownership of this land, rather than inventing it themselves. So while it's impossible to know what really happened, there does at least seem to be something to it. Tewdrig was supposedly buried at Merthyr Tewdrig, a name that remembers his martyrdom, and according to the only Welsh calendar mentioning it, he is commemorated on the 3rd of January. Were his bones really buried somewhere under this church, protecting his kingdom for far more than 30 years? We don't know. The detail of a burial protecting a country isn't novel, but I suppose it's worth pointing out that the Anglo-Saxons never did conquer this land. We don't know very much about Tewdrig outside of this story. He supposedly founded the royal dynasties of South Wales, but there's quite a large gap between the Roman Empire withdrawing and Tewdrig ruling. We don't know who or what preceded him. We don't even know who his father is. One saint's biography claimed it was a man born about 3 centuries prior because he also had a son named Tewdrig, but I don't think that's how that works. But at least we have something. This story, however muddled and altered it may be, after being passed down over the centuries, it's more than we have for almost anyone else in his lineage. For comparison, his own son was left out of the early royal genealogies, and we will never know if he had any siblings. Tewdrig, king and martyr, went cheerfully with his son on that day, knowing not just how and when he would die, but that he needed to. And when it finally happened, he rejoiced as if a battle had been won. If you were told the day, place, and manner of your death, would you have gone? Thank you for watching.
Good day, fleshy mammals.
In 1809, Richard Gough donated a spectacular map to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, a depiction of Great Britain sometime between 1355 and 1366. Although perhaps a little crude and inaccurate by today's standards, this map is incredible, preserving hundreds of place names and towns and rivers and something else. You see, the people from one region in particular were especially astounded by this map, as off the coast of Ceredigion in Wales there were two fairly large, featureless blobs. There were islands. Well, you'd think that's nothing unusual, right? There's a couple of other unlabeled islands on this map, but that's not the problem. You see, there are no islands in this part of Ceredigion Bay. These islands today do not exist. And while the discovery of two now lost landmasses is interesting, some people became even more curious, because there exists a story, a local legend, of two kingdoms that once ruled lands off the coast of Ceredigion, one on an island and one on a large flat plain, both of which were destroyed by the encroaching ocean. Two long-lost landmasses, now accompanied by two long-lost islands. I would tell you that this is the story of the myth of a land that fell beneath the waves, but really this is the story of what was supposed to be the myth of the medieval kingdom that sank into the ocean. Before we get started, I want to quickly talk about the sponsor that makes this video possible, Babbel. Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world, with intuitive lessons that help you learn through actual real-life conversations, rather than just reciting words like I had to do in school. Babbel's lessons are designed by real language teachers to prepare you for actual practical conversations and are a great method to improve your skills, whether that's just for travel, friends, family, business, or just to improve your own self. I've started learning their Spanish course, not only because learning through real-world conversations is so much better, but also because I'm from the UK, which means I have to infest the shores of Spain at least once every few years. And what I've personally found is that even just attempting to use words and phrases in someone's native language can make a massive difference. Babbel also offers a 20-day money-back guarantee, which means you can try it and have no worries if you don't like it. Plus, they offer a multitude of different subscriptions to suit you best, and you get 2 free live classes. Click the link in the description and the pinned comment and get 60% off of your subscription today. Give Babbel a try and see just how far 15 minutes of learning a language can take you. That's the link down in the description box or in the pinned comment. Thank you. The oldest physical copy of this story can be found in a book known as the Llyfr di Cyfyrddin, the Black Book of Carmarthen, which dates to around 1225 at the earliest, which is almost as old as you. In here we find a poem. It's fairly short and there's no title, but it goes something like this. Our narrator cries out to a man named Saithennin and tells him to behold a disaster that has just unfolded before him. The sea has been raging and billowing, and now it's overflowed over the ramparts and completely flooded an area of land known as Maes Gwyddno. The narrator curses a maiden named Mererid, who we're told released the sea after a feast with some strong wines. They then lament and despair for a few verses until we're told that Saithennin, the weak or feeble-minded, has died and been buried near the shore. That's not a lot to go off of, but it does tell us a few things. Firstly, according to the story, somewhere on the coast there used to be a plain of land known as Maes Gwyddno. It was apparently being protected from the encroaching sea by some ramparts and by a woman named Mererid, who was given the title of Ffynnon Menester Morterwyn, the fountain cupbearer of the powerful sea. Not something you typically find on a CV, and that makes this line stand out a lot, especially because apparently after some strong wines, she let the ocean flood Maes Gwyddno, suggesting that it was actively her job to keep the water at bay. We're also introduced to a man named Saithennin, but all he does is look at the ocean. And finally, we're introduced to someone named Gwyddno. In this poem, that's just the name of this plain, but in another poem within the same book, he's revealed to be a person. In this poem, a king named Gwyn ap Nudd is boasting to someone about all of his accomplishments, claiming to be an unparalleled warrior. The man he is boasting to is described as having his shield in distress, suggesting that Gwyn has just bested him in combat. And in his defeat, the man reveals his name to be Gwyddno Garanhir, which means Longshanks. Now, Gwyddno is not a unique name. We're aware of about 6 other various kings or fathers of saints in Welsh history with the same name, but what our Gwyddno Garanhir has going for him is that he's here. He's the only Gwyddno present in this collection of poems, one of which recounts a story of a land bearing his name that was flooded by the ocean. This connection was not lost on the Welsh poets over the next few centuries. Gwtor Glyn writes about how God commanded the ocean to destroy Gwyddno Garanhir's lands, but the poet Lewis Morris just blames it on the waves instead. It's even referenced in an elegy from the 1500s, as Lewis Morgannwg, for some reason, reminds the funeral goers about how Gwyddno Garanhir's castle was sunk beneath the waves. Lewis's lack of situational awareness, along with the other 2 poets, tell us that the story was fairly notable. People were expected to know and understand what they were talking about. But there's not much to this story, is there? We're told who Mererid is, but Seithenyn and even Gwyddno, the man who gave his name to this land, are completely unknown. And how does this even tie into our islands in Ceredigion Bay? We don't even have a location for this story. Luckily for us, we do have more clues, because while the Black Book of Carmarthen may preserve the oldest physical version of this story, there exists a text that seems to contain some much more ancient elements. We can find these in a book known as Hanes Taliesin. The oldest manuscript we have is from 1552, and it tells a semi-prophetic story about a bard named, well, Taliesin. But the parts that are most relevant to us are near the very beginning. When Taliesin was born, he was said to have been cast down a river in a basket, until landing at a weir named Corred Wyddno. Here, a man named Elfyn finds him and takes him back to his father, Gwyddno Garanhir, confirming to the readers and to us now that this is indeed our Gwyddno whose lands sunk into the ocean. Hanes Taliesin makes no mention of this flooding though, implying perhaps that it had already taken place, maybe even implying that our plain, Maes Gwyddno, had been flooded and all that remained was a weir, Corred Wyddno. Taliesin himself was from the 6th century. He's associated with 2 kings from around this time, Cynon of Powys and Malcolm of Gwynedd. In addition, his surviving poetry is entirely written in Old Welsh, dated by the historian Ivor Williams to either the 6th or 7th centuries, placing Gwyddno and his mysterious flooded lands at around the same date. You may be thinking that this doesn't matter at all though. This manuscript is much newer than the Black Book of Carmarthen, right? So what does this have to do with our story? Well, while this physical version of Hanes Taliesin was written in the 1500s, the story itself appears to be much older. Elements from this book are referenced in Taliesin's 6th to 7th century poetry, and the story itself is filled with strange and fascinating pre-Christian elements, such as reincarnation, spells, human-to-animal transformations, being born under evil hours, and so on. What this tells us then is that, potentially, the story of Gwyddno Garanhir and his sunken lands are from as early as the 6th or 7th centuries, which would explain Gwyddno's sudden, unexplained appearance in the Black Book of Carmarthen. Our story is now a little more fleshed out, and we can cautiously pinpoint its origins to around the 6th century AD, or at the very least sometime before 1225. We still have a couple of questions though. Who is Seithenyn? Where exactly is this plain and weir of Gwyddno? And what does this have to do with those mysterious islands from 1355? Well, one of those answers is actually given to us in this very manuscript. But if you're already familiar with this story, I promise it's not going to be what you expect. This 1552 document squarely places the Weir of Gwyddno, these lost lands, right here, at the mouth of the River Conwy in North Wales. So, is this mysterious flooded plain located over here? Well, in another document, this time from 1610, Corred Wyddno is placed somewhere else entirely, instead putting it between Aberystwyth and Aberdyfi in West Wales. But surely we can trust the older manuscript more, right? Well, no, because in another document, Leyland's itinerary from around 1536, he mentions the story of lands cleanly devoured by the sea, being located between Aberdyfi and Tywyn in Meirionydd. So to recap, in 1536 we have our flooded plain in the west, but in 1552 it's moved to the north, only to be taken back to Ceredigion in 1610. This weir cannot have been in more than one location, unless we're to think that it snaked around half of the Welsh coast, so presumably one of these manuscripts are right. And it wouldn't be all that uncommon for copies of a story to pick up a few corrections and embellishments over the course of 1,000 years, and in fact we are already aware of one. Gwyddno's son Elphin is a known mistake. This name comes from the north of Britain, specifically from a manuscript documenting the ancestry of some Brythonic kings in the north, which tells us of a man named Gwyddno ap Cawdraf, and gives him a son, Elphin, the Welsh form of Alpin. Hanes Taliesin seems to have been aware of this and corrected the name of Gwyddno's son in the story to match this man of the north, despite the fact that he is never associated with Wales at all. And to add to the confusion, later versions, now seemingly aware of the story in Hanes Taliesin, then add the epithet Garin here to this man of the north, and say that he owned Corrad Wyddno, teleporting him from the north of Britain to somewhere in Wales, in a document explicitly about the north of Britain. So if a passing similarity can jumble up a story so easily, then is it possible that the same thing happened to the location of Corrad Wyddno? Is there a similar story that the writer of Hanes Taliesin could have mistakenly corrected his document to match in either Conwy or Ceredigion? And can we use this to figure out where this story is supposed to be? Yes, in fact, there are a few, because Maes Gwyddno is not the only story of a kingdom lost beneath the waves. In a triad, a short snippet of traditional Welsh poetry, myth or legend, preserved only in a single random manuscript from 1280 in Exeter, we encounter our other three sunken kingdoms. These are the kingdoms which the sea destroyed. The kingdom of Teithi Hen, called Caer Rihok or Ynys Teithi Hen, which could be found between St. David's and Ireland. No men or beasts escaped from the sea here, except for Teithi Hen alone. The second was the kingdom of Helig ap Glanog, which was between Ceredigion, Ynys Enlli and St. David's. The land was called Maes Megan and was found between the Mouth, Teherhin and Aberdyfi. The third was the kingdom of Redvoy ap Reged. This manuscript has opened a lot of doors to us, so let's explore them, starting from the bottom. Redvoy here is a bit of a letdown. Nothing is told to us about him except that he has an association with Reged, a Brythonic kingdom around modern-day Cumbria in England, which would place him in the north, but sadly that's where we're going to have to leave him for now. Teithi Hen from the First Kingdom is a rare figure found in only a single piece of Welsh mythology, a story known as Culhwch ac Olwen, where we find him in the court of King Arthur. He tells us, just like the Triad, that his kingdom was overrun by the ocean, leaving him as the only survivor, although nothing else really happens to him. What's really interesting about Teithi though, is that his kingdom was an island, Ynys Teithi Hen. Do you remember at the start of this video when I said two legends of sunken kingdoms exist, one on an island and one on a plain? Well, this is that island, and is referenced in another place outside of this triad. In the Book of Llandav, another medieval Welsh text, a saint known as Odosius is once said to have overseen a diocese stretching from Mocas near Hereford to as far as Ynys Teithi. However, a king in South Wales named Cadogan apparently expelled his clergy from everywhere west of the Towey, shrinking his diocese and, if Ynys Teithi was supposedly the furthest point from Hereford, placing our mysterious island somewhere west of the Towey. Of course, the Triad claims that it was between St. David's in Ireland, but there's no geological evidence for what would have to be a 100 to 120 metre volcano just below the surface. What there is evidence for, though, are two missing islands in Ceredigion Bay. Let's quickly have a look at that second kingdom belonging to Helig, because as you may have already noticed, it's located in around the same place that the 1610 copy of Hanes Taliesin claimed that Corrad Wyddno was located, with Helig's lands being placed right in Ceredigion Bay between the Mouth, Teherhin and Aberdyfi. The Mouth is likely a river mouth or aber in Welsh and could technically be anywhere, but one version of Hanes Taliesin names the town of Aberystwyth alongside Aberdyfi as being the location of Corrad Wyddno. Teherhin though is much harder to locate. The historian Peter Bartram cautiously suggested that it could be the Llyn Peninsula. Tehe, Hin and Llyn are a little similar, although I think it bears a bit more resemblance to Teithi Hen, potentially as a reference to Ynys Teithi Hen. So if we look back to our mysterious islands on this map of Britain, we can spot something exciting. This more northern island is located precisely between Aberystwyth and Aberdyfi, just like the 1610 manuscript of Hanes Taliesin says. And if this southern island is supposed to be the remnants of Ynys Teithi Hen, then this land is located exactly where the Triad said it was, between Aberdyfi, Tehe Hin or Teithi Hen, and an Aber, likely Aberystwyth.
Good day, fleshy mammals.
Therefore, as I said at the start of this video, we do appear to have actual physical locations attached to these mythical lands of Teithi Hen and Maes Gwyddno, two islands off the coast of Ceredigion that disappeared at least by the 1600s. The problem though is that this isn't named as the location of the famous Maes Gwyddno, a land that had been referenced in poetry from potentially the 6th century. It's named as somewhere else entirely, the kingdom of Helig ap Glanog and Maes Maven. Furthermore, why do some texts associate Maes Gwyddno with the north and Conwy? How can this island be attached to any legend if the location cannot even be agreed upon? The answer comes from the question I asked at the start of the last chapter. Is there a similar story to that of Maes Gwyddno that the writer of Hanes Taliesin could have mistakenly corrected his story to match? And as we've seen, yes, there are at least 3 other tales of sunken kingdoms, and one of these is practically identical in terms of location to the Weir of Gwyddno described in Hanes Taliesin, and to the tales of sunken lands described in Leyland's itinerary. So is it possible that over the centuries, details between the kingdoms of Gwyddno and Helig could have become confused with one another? Yes, but is it possible that there were just 2 sunken lands in the Bay of Ceredigion? Also yes, but that would leave the question as to why that 1552 text of Hanes Taliesin would so concretely place the Weir of Gwyddno at the mouth of the River Conwy. He must have made a mistake, just like how he adopted a different Gwyddno son into the story, right? But a mistake from where? Well, the answer may lie between King Helig's full name, Helig ap Glanog. This just means that he's the son of someone named Glanog, but the problem here is that, as far as I'm aware, we don't know anyone named Glanog within this period of Welsh history. But what we are aware of is a place known as Glanog. In English it was known as Priestholm or Puffin Island today on the account of all the puffins and the noticeable lack of priests, but in Welsh it was known as Ynys Glanog, becoming Ynys Seriol in the 1500s. This name, Ynys Glanog, is also really old. It's first seen in a document known as the Annals Cambrian, where in 629 AD, King Cadwallon is recorded as being besieged on the island of Glanog, a Latin spelling that was reproduced identically in that Exeter triad, where the kingdom of Helig ap Glanog is mentioned as being lost beneath the waves. Also near Ynys Glanog is a stretch of sand known as Traeth Helig, and while the specific location of this beach is now lost, a 15th century text pinpoints it to somewhere near the Lord of Penrhyn in Gwynedd, North Wales, and near Ynys Glanog. So while some surviving texts associate Helig and Gwyddno with the same legend of a sunken kingdom in Ceredigion Bay, Helig's name is heavily associated with this region of North Wales, potentially from as early as the 7th century. Something that also places Helig within North Wales are the 16th century genealogical manuscripts. They were drawn up by the wealthy to demonstrate their ancient, typically royal ancestries. And while they're for the most part quite jumbled and messy, they do frequently contain some useful information. But for today they demonstrate something that's usually not talked about with medieval sources. They demonstrate what the people of the time believed to be true. Namely, while Hanes Taliesin named Gwyddno as the king of a sunken kingdom in North Wales, and while a triad 200 years prior placed Helig as the ruler of lands lost to the sea in West Wales, the gentry, the people who would be familiar with the story, who those poets and bards would perform to, recounting the details of these lost kingdoms, believed Helig to be the ancestor of the wealthy men of Arllechwedd and Gwynedd Ys Conwy, both in North Wales. Whilst Gwyddno was claimed as an ancestor of the gentry of Arllechwedd again, but mainly of Llyn, Eifionydd, Meirionnydd, Ceredigion, and a cantref or county that those of you who are familiar with the story have likely been waiting to hear the entire time. Cantref y Gwaelod, the sunken or bottom county, a name that appears to originate with the 16th century genealogies. So in the 15th century, while some surviving texts are placing Helig in the west and Gwyddno in the north, the gentry, the rich and powerful, the men with the time and the money to read and write and listen to poetry, and whose reputations banked on claiming ancestry to famous and powerful figures, claimed that Helig was from North Wales and that Gwyddno was from around Ceredigion Bay. Over the next few centuries, these legends of sunken kingdoms would grow, but it seems that the similarities that led to Helig and Gwyddno's tales to be confused for one another would eventually lead to the demise of Helig ap Glanog's story altogether, as our Cantref a Gwaelod captured the imaginations of the poets and writers over the next few centuries instead. While our Gwyddno Garan here and his sunken county, spelled Cantref a Gwaelod today, would form a local legend famous in Wales even up to now, the last time Helig would get any sort of notable mention was in 1625. Here we're told that Helig lands, again now mistakenly called Cantref Gwaelod rather than the older Maes Maiden, lay between Bangor and Penygorgarth in North Wales, with the ruins of Helig Palace apparently being visible out in Conwy Bay at very low tides. And in fact, in an 18th century sea chart of Wales, which the National Library of Wales very kindly gave me permission to use, we can see these ruins, or rather what these ruins really are. A collection of rocks located just below the surface, known as Caer Conwy. What's really interesting though, is that right next to it is a weir, Cored Valgun, named after the 6th century king of this area, and is found right in the place that Anas Taliesin claimed that Cored Wyddno could be found. It seems that we may have discovered the source for all of that confusion in the 1500s. There are 2 sunken kingdoms and 2 weirs, one in the north, Cored Valgun, and one in the west, Cored Wyddno, although we don't yet know where Cored Wyddno is. So despite centuries of confusions and mixings and corrections and embellishments, it really seems like Helig is associated with Ynys Glanog, Traeth Helig, Caer Conwy, and Cored Valgun, all in North Wales. While Gwyddno Garan here is associated with the lands off the coast of Aberystwyth, Aberdyfi, Ynys Teithi Hen, and wherever Cored Wyddno is, finally leading us back to those 2 missing islands. We can now much more concretely say that the story of Cantref a Gwaelod and Maes Gwyddno is associated with this area of coast, between Aberystwyth and Aberdyfi, and with these 2 mysterious islands. We've seen the evolution of what people thought for centuries was just a myth. We've seen how it's been confused and corrected and rewritten, but now we have to ask one final question. Why are there missing landmasses exactly where a story about missing landmasses takes place? Since the 1990s, a number of historians have proposed that these stories may be more than stories, that the tale of Cantref a Gwaelod may have a basis in history. More specifically, Matthews, Davis, Nunn, Kavanagh and Bates have all separately proposed over the last 30 years that this myth is rooted in a folk memory, that is, a piece of history passed down orally for hundreds, sometimes thousands of years. Now what folk memory are they suggesting that these flooded kingdoms are based on? The melting of the glaciers and the rising of the sea levels at the end of the Ice Age. This sounds very reasonable. The western side of Great Britain in the Irish Sea has a lot of very shallow water. The whole of Ceredigion Bay only reaches a maximum depth of about 40 metres, and only about 20 metres up to here. The same is true for the coast of North Wales, where Helig ap Glanog's sunken kingdom was based. What these historians are proposing then is that the Welsh retained a memory of settlements and kingdoms being gradually destroyed by the encroachment of the ocean over the span of a few thousand years, eventually passing this memory down the centuries until it became adopted as the tale of 3 kingdoms that were lost beneath the waves. Our friend Redvoy ap Reged can also make a return here, as plenty of land around the county of Cumbria is similarly low-lying and was presumably also lost and passed down in memory. There is a problem though. That isn't how the story goes, is it? Teithi Hen didn't slowly lose his island over the course of a few years. It was suddenly and violently ripped away, leaving him as the only survivor. Gwyddno and Saethenin didn't stand around for a century, watching their kingdom slowly overflow. They witnessed it be destroyed in a sudden, unexpected event, when the raging sea billowed and overtook their ramparts. We know that this folk memory survived in Wales, it's referenced in the Mabinogion, but again, here it's much more casual. It says that in those days the deep water between Ireland and Wales was not wide. There were two rivers, the Llŷ and Archan, but afterwards the water grew wider when the deep overflowed the kingdoms. There's a reference to our sunken kingdoms here, but these stories were written down in the Middle Ages, and we can't be certain if they were always referenced, or if the person transcribing the text just decided to include these famous tales. But regardless, the glaciers did not melt and flood the coast of Britain all at once. So even if the stories of Gwyddno and Helig and Taethy Hen have roots in these ancient memories, there must be another source of inspiration. Haslett and Willis, in a paper on these islands, note that it's possible that the story of Gwyddno Garan here was describing a major storm, or even a tsunami. The sea raging and billowing and rising up and over the walls of the kingdom certainly sounds like a tidal wave, and there are other legends about these waves in Wales too. A medieval text known as the Historia Brittonum mentions a story of the ocean receding near the River Severn here and throwing up a mountainous wave, which covered the shore of South Wales. This is a perfect description of a tsunami that must have occurred sometime before the 9th century when this text was written, so is it unreasonable to think that perhaps some very hostile waves struck the coast of Wales before the time of Taliesin in the 6th century, when the legend of Maes Gwyddno may have already existed? An earthquake somewhere in or near the Irish Sea could theoretically cause large waves to attack the western coast of Wales and a tsunami to run up the Severn Sea, but we can't be certain about that at all. As Halsett and Willis say, it's a question that requires further investigation. The final place we can look for clues on the origins and merit of these stories are on the islands themselves. We know that they disappeared by at least the 1600s, but they don't actually appear on a single other map apart from the Goth map in 1355. So what does this mean? Firstly, you may have said that they were just a mistake, and that's of course possible but very unlikely. You see, unlike with the poorly drawn Scotland, English cartographers had full, unrestricted access to Wales at this time. They weren't just guessing coastlines. What this means then is that these islands likely existed, but that they were fairly small and low-lying, allowing them to be eroded by the 1600s. But of course, if we had landmasses here that disappeared below the waves, you'd expect to still be able to find evidence of them, right? And we can, because while the islands only appear on one map, we can find their remains on two. Greenwood's 1834 map of Wales includes something very interesting. A long, thin line stretching from just north of Aberystwyth out into the sea, ending at a small, unlabelled patch of something below the waves. And what this something is actually answered for us on an earlier map. Do you remember that coastal chart of Wales that marked the supposed location of Helig's palace under the waves? Well, on that same chart, extending out to the sea from Aberystwyth, we find Sarn Cynfelyn, ending at an outcrop of rocks which we're told are visible during the low tides of spring. And what are these rocks called? Caer Gwyddno, the name of the man whose story we've been chasing for over 1,000 years. These Sarnai that Caer Gwyddno is located on are long deposits of rocks left over from the Ice Age and extending far out into the sea. We have the one I already mentioned, Sarn Cynfelyn, the much shorter Sarn y Buwch north of Aberdyfi, and the colossal Sarn Badrig near Harlech, which extends for over 12 miles. These rocky paths are huge and prominent and visible during low spring tides, and don't they look remarkably like walls? Is it possible that the stories of Maes Gwyddno and Ynys Taethy Hen were based in a historic memory of the ocean swallowing up the lands of Ceredigion Bay? Perhaps further dramatised by the memory of a tidal wave or a huge storm by the 6th century? Sure. We know that these memories survived in other places. Why couldn't they be adapted further? There are remains of ancient forests here also that become visible in very low tides. These could have easily inspired or amplified the memory of a lost plain of dry land. Perhaps also there were settlements on these islands. Ynys Taethy Hen was supposed to be the furthest part of a diocese, so were there people to preach to on here? Caer Gwyddno is also noted as a famous location to catch fish in Hanes Taliesin, so there may have been a small community on Caer Gwyddno until the island became too small and eroded to live on. But this story of the sunken Cantref, the kingdom at the bottom of Ceredigion Bay, protected by ramparts until a drunken Mererid accidentally let loose a surging ocean over these walls, Could these have been inspired by the Sarni, the huge rocky barriers extending for miles out into the ocean? It's certainly possible. And in any case, these Sarni are almost certainly where these two mysterious islands were located. We already have Caer Withnaw presumably attached to Corrid Withnaw or San Convellan, but it seems like the Goth map has actually placed them slightly too far south, meaning that I'll have to take back something I suggested earlier and place the hypothetical location of Unis Teithi Hen on this northern island instead, leaving Caer Withnaw in between Aberystwyth, Aberdyfi and Teher Hen, possibly Teithi Hen. One final point I want to bring up before we finish the video are the names we started this entire video with, Gwyddno and Seithenyn. Gwyddno has a story to him, but this seems to have developed later, and Seithenyn ultimately was actually given Mererid's story. She was written out, but originally he starts with nothing. So who are they? One suggestion for Seithenyn is that he may be a very corrupt form of Teithi Hen. Getting rid of the S makes the names look extremely similar, but they would be pronounced quite differently. And then we have to ask how an S even got added in the first place. Gwyddno, though, is interesting. Unlike his counterpart Helig ap Glannog or Red Boy Reged, he doesn't have any geographical connections. Although, as I mentioned at the very start of this video, there are other people named Gwyddno. This name is associated with two places, Hen Ogledd, the Brythonic-speaking north, and Ceredigion Bay. Two saints in this area have fathers named Gwyddno. Two kings in the north are named Gwyddno, and finally one king in Meirionydd is also named Gwyddno. I bring this up because Hanes Taliesin claims that King Gwyddno ruled lands near Corrid Withnaw, or San Convellan, and King Gwyddno of Meirionydd both had a son, Idris, who died around 632, and ruled Meirionydd, placing him both near Corrid Withnaw and at around the time of the Bard Taliesin. Of course, this story is, as we've seen, severely jumbled and confused. I think it's just worth pointing out that there is at least one historical Gwyddno who could have inspired the name of the king, or the Weir. With all that complete, let's finally summarise what we've seen and recount what was just supposed to be the myth of the missing islands and the kingdoms that were lost beneath the waves. Several thousand years ago, the ocean was much shallower. The crossing between Wales and Ireland was narrower, and the lands that are now the coastal waters of Ceredigion Bay were covered in forests and long, snaking glacial deposits. As the temperatures rose and the ice began to melt, these lands were gradually lost to the waves, a memory that must have been impactful to the people of Great Britain, as thousands of years later, stories were still recalled of a time where the waters of the Irish Sea were much less deep. What these rising oceans left behind in Wales, though, were a series of ridges or sarni, two now missing islands on the ends of them, and a trio of stories, three kingdoms whose land was supposedly lost beneath the waves. But the idea that these myths were based on a memory of the ocean gradually rising is debated, because two of them tell a much more sudden and violent tale of a raging sea leaving all but one survivor. These billowing waves may have instead been inspired by a tsunami that struck the coast of South Wales sometime before the 9th century, and as our story of Maes Gwyddno may originate in the 6th, this tidal wave may have appeared much earlier. The memory of a land lost to the sea, coupled with the striking imagery of the submerged, petrified forest near Ynys Las in Western Wales, was no doubt inspiring. Pair this with two small islands that may have had their own communities who were vulnerable to storms and waves, and the genesis of a myth appears. But the tale of Maes Gwyddno and Cantra Gwaelod may be based in history, as the island and weir bearing Gwyddno's name did actually exist. And while the colossal sarni stretching for miles out into the ocean may have inspired a story of a drunken Mererid accidentally flooding the ramparts of an entire kingdom, a very real storm or tidal wave may have posed a genuine threat to anyone living near or on these low-lying islands. And all it takes is the destructive memory of one rogue wave to inspire a story that lasts for millennia. Similarities between the story of Gwyddno's Cantra Gwaelod and Helig's sunken kingdom would lead to centuries of confusion, with details being crossed and swapped and corrected dozens of times. However, to the people familiar with the story in the 1500s, Gwyddno was categorically from the west of Wales, while Helig was supposed to be from the north, with his ruins seen in the rocks submerged just out in Conwy Bay. In any case, a story that was once thought to be a simple tall tale was forever changed with the discovery that, well, there really were some sunken islands off of the coast of Wales, which makes you wonder if there could be any other kernels of truth within the other stories of the kingdoms lost to sea. Thank you very much for watching. Thank you again to the National Library of Wales for allowing me to use their sea charts, and thanks to Babel for sponsoring this video. And if you're interested in the histories of lost or missing kingdoms, then you're in luck, because I have 2 more in a playlist for you right here.
Lord Vader, é um inesperado prazer. Estamos honrados com sua presença.
Dispense as amabilidades, comandante. Estou aqui para terminar com o atraso das obras.
Eu lhe garanto que nossos homens estão trabalhando o mais rápido que podem.
Talvez eu possa encontrar novas razões para motivá-los.
Eu garanto que esta estação estará operando como planejado, senhor.
O Imperador não participa do seu...
Tan optimista de la situación actual.
Pero él pide lo imposible. Necesito más hombres.
Entonces, tal vez...
And he said, "Oh, if I like it, I don't say anything." So great to know.
And we can never collect enough squeaky doors and electric motors in order to make up all the different sounds.
I hope so, Commander, for your sake.
Goodness gracious me. Тримайте мене.
R2-D2.
Bo, si tripio, ei, tuta, miska, java duhot. Sake para su amo, java el hot.
Java Wonka.
Okay. Motto, we bring a message für deinen Herrn, Jabba.
Java Wonka.
Motto, traemos un mensaje para su señor Jabba el Hutt.
Java Wonka.
Musimy wieść dla twojego pana, Jabby Hutta, oraz dar. Jaki dar?
A? Taky dárek? Našíme poselství tvému pánovi, Jabba Huttovi. A? Taky dárek?
Impresionante no es la palabra que yo usaría.
Bezeichnet.
Eu quero que a leve. Sinceramente, pode levar. Você precisa de toda a ajuda que puder conseguir. Ela é a nave mais veloz de toda a nossa frota.
Eu sei.